the soul of organic, which is that it really truly does need to be sustainable. It needs to be done, in a not just ecologically friendly, but ecologically like beneficent way, where like my role here is not to just like not destroy the environment around me, but to make it better, to watch my ecosystem improve over time, to see more wildlife, to watch more, ducks land in my pond, to see more deer in my fields. Like, those are good things. Unfortunately, the economic realities of dairy farming are just such that the pressure put on by the processors, by the purchasers of milk, is just to drive the price lower and lower.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on pasture. You just heard from Earl Ransom of Vermont's Strafford Creamery, one of the few dairy farms in the Northeast that still bottles and sells milk right from the farm. Earl has a long view into the history of the takeover of small dairies by corporations, and he shares that and more in this interview with my co-director, Dave Chapman.
I'm visiting today with Earl Ransom at Strafford Organic Creamery. Earl, I was saying, I first came to this farm years ago to help clear some land for your dad, your mom, a long time ago.
Yeah, well, that was, that history of the farm is long and a little bit tortured, but it's, we're still here, still doing what we do. Still clear land, actually. Just cleared another 5 acres of pasture land, so.
Yeah. How many acres of field do you have now?
Got about 250 acres of fields. Here at home, about 100 of that is cropland. The rest is pasture.
Yeah.
And then we grow on about another 200 and just over 200 acres of rented hay ground, nearby farms.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. How many cows do you milk?
Milk 76 today. We'll hit 80 this winter. It's more than I really want to milk, but it's, it works for us. We've been growing steadily for 20 years. So.
Yeah. So in all that time, did you start shipping? When you started, were you shipping milk to somebody?
Yeah. So when I graduated from college and came back to Vermont, which I hadn't expected to do, I started shipping milk to the Organic Cow in Chelsea, which was Peter and Bunny Flint, and they were, it was the 22nd or 23rd farm that was shipping milk to them in Vermont. That was in the early 90s, mid 90s. Then we shipped milk to them from, 96 until 2000, till the spring of 2000. Because they sold their milk processing operation to Horizon. Through, several steps in between there, but Horizon ended up owning it, and they were going to cut the pay price, and we started looking at alternatives, and we just decided that we'd start processing milk, process our own milk, and see if we could find a market for it.
That must have been somewhere near the beginning of Horizon.
Yeah, well, Horizon started out west somewhere. I think Colorado, yeah. And they, back then they weren't that big. They didn't have that many farms. Most of their farms were not huge. The Colorado farms for Vermont scale were much bigger, but they were still small for Western dairy farms, a couple hundred cows, maybe. None of them, I don't think even approached 1,000. But even then, they were really looking to have those farms be captive farms. So they owned some or all of those farms.
By owned, how do you mean that?
So Horizon, first they started out, they would provide the funding for a farm to transition and keep a percentage ownership. This is my understanding. I don't have the ins and outs of their business, but so they would facilitate the loan, and they would then own a portion of so they could have your milk at the price that they set, because they had been the ones who got you the loan to get you through the transition.
Yeah.
And then they just bought farms outright. They would just be like, we're going to buy a farm, we're going to hire someone to run it, so that we have that milk supply is in-house instead of contracting with a farmer. That was their business model, even then, was to own the production all the way through processing at a large scale.
That's very interesting.
And they couldn't grow very fast, and of course that story doesn't sell very well to the general public, to like have we're a big company and we own these farms with several thousand cows and we process the milk and we bring that milk to you. Like, I don't think most consumers want to hear that. Most consumers would rather know that there's a farmer who's making their living raising, growing, producing that product, and it's coming to them, like either through a distributor or middleman or whatever, however you want to see it.
Yeah. And of course the challenge that we face is that there is another side to it. There is an industrial complex.
Yeah.
And they're very good at telling the story, whether or not they're telling a true story.
Yeah.
They're very good at telling a story that people want to hear.
Yeah.
They figure out, what is it people want to hear? Let's tell that story. I mean, I think that's why the Real Organic Project exists.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the challenge, of course, especially the way the world is now, is that, like, telling the truth is not necessarily, it's bugs. It's not necessarily regarded as being, like, you can just lie about stuff and be like, this is where your milk, they can tell a story like, this is where your milk comes from, and show pictures of a farm that's been out of business for 10 years. A little hill farm in Vermont, and be like, to use Horizon again, the example is like, the Chapman family farm, which has been out of business for 3 years, is still really prominent in all their advertising materials. Mm-hmm. They don't milk cows anymore, like, at all. There are no cows being milked on that farm, whether it's the Chapman family or anybody else. It's just empty. But they still use those images because it sells.
Yeah. Yeah.
All
right.
Go
ahead.
Anyway, for us, the nice thing about being in Vermont and in northern New England, or New England in general, is that, like, we don't actually spend a lot of time telling our story because we can't produce enough milk to meet the demands of the customers that we already have, which is the thing that boggles my mind about why anybody would pull out of buying milk from New England farms, is that, like, our advertising budget is $0. Like, we don't spend any money on advertising. Like, we have an Instagram account that's run by my herdsman's wife, who just does it because she likes to take pictures, and that's it. So.
Okay, so there seems to be a puzzle here. Help me unpack that. So for you can't keep up with demand. In fact, you said, we're adding cows this winter because we have a demand to meet and we're not meeting it. And of course, the 89 farms that are going to get dropped by Horizon next year, what do you think is going to happen to them?
Well, some of them will get picked up by another processor, and some of them are going to go out of business. And then the rest of them will probably be forced out of business, unfortunately. And, we've been approached by a number of people who are like, why can't you expand? We don't have and buy milk from these other farms. And, like, the way that that things are structured to, by the federal government and by everybody, all the regulatory agencies, to buy milk from farms, truck it here and process it, that infrastructure is really huge. It's kind of insanely expensive to buy a truck and to have a wash bay for that truck. You have to have a garage big enough to park an entire truck in so you can wash the entire truck inside and out to truck milk.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be able to receive that. The truck backs into a building to empty the milk out of it. It's the only way to do it, which means you got to build a building big enough to fit an entire milk tank truck inside, which just in terms of, I mean, we don't have that many square feet of building to process milk, much less receive milk.
Right.
And the cost to build a plant to process milk in New England, if I was going to build a plant from the ground up, and I actually looked into this just, for my own entertainment as much as anything else, it would cost between $8 and $12 million to build a plant to buy milk from those close to 100 farms and process it somewhere in New England. And the truth is that it's just like, I don't know if you'd ever pay that off with, processing that milk, because the plant capacity, like, you'd be able to, the same money, you could build a plant to process milk from 100 farms, you could essentially build a plant to process from 1,500 farms. It's the same dollars, it's just bigger tanks and bigger equipment. Doesn't need to be a bigger building, it's just, just some bigger tanks, which are mostly outside. Which is, unfortunately, that's the, sort of the way of industrial processing. That's the way it goes. The scale that we process at is really artisanal. I mean, like, our equipment is ridiculously small, and there's nothing in between. I mean, it just doesn't exist.
So there's this artisanal scale in which you're growing cows that are healthier, they're on pasture, they're eating what God meant cows to eat, and they're walking around to get to the pasture, and they come into milk twice a day. And then you're processing that milk. How many products are you making out of your milk?
So we do 4 white fluid milks and chocolate milk. Then we do half and half. We do eggnog seasonally, and we do 14 flavors of ice cream.
What percentage of your milk goes into ice cream, would you guess?
I think it's about between 12 and 15% of the volume.
Yeah.
Goes into ice cream.
So the lion's share is your direct sale of milk.
Yeah.
And that's not something that people come to the farm and pick up. It's something that gets delivered to stores.
Yeah. So we have a distributor that comes and picks up the milk and takes it to stores all over Vermont. We also sell milk to Farmers to You, which is a company that buys our products here and takes them to the Boston area and has a distribution system it's not exactly home delivery, but it's similar to that. So people order online, you pick up your box of whatever products.
How much of the milk that gets, the liquid milk, fluid milk that gets drunk in Vermont, do you think is milked in Vermont? Or even on a percentage basis? I know that the milk that gets, mostly the milk that is milked in Vermont gets shipped out of state to processors.
Yes, that's true. I mean, where your milk is processed depends on who you buy your milk from. So, I mean, there's a bunch of small to medium-sized processors in Vermont that are still buying. The majority of their milk comes from Vermont farms. Booth Brothers is one. Monument Farms, which is over in Middlebury area, is another. And both of those places buy. So Booth Brothers, I think, buys from about 35 farms, mostly in central Vermont. I think there's a few that are in New Hampshire, 1 or 2 in Lyme, and maybe 1 in Piermont. And that milk is trucked to Barry, bottled, and sold in Vermont. Same with Monument. There's a few other small processors that were bottling milk in Vermont. It's are ancient. I mean, the Booth Brothers plant, I think, was built from the 20s through the 40s. And you go in it, and it's old. I mean, it still works. They're still putting out a decent quality product as far as I can tell. And they're people they're conventional milk. They're not organic, but the people who are shipping milk to them seem to be pretty happy with that relationship. But their market is pretty limited in terms of Vermont. I mean, you'd think, 35 farms, it's probably, I don't know what percentage of milk for the state of Vermont that is probably maybe 20%, 15% of the milk that's consumed in Vermont
comes from Vermont.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard to say because like if you're buying like a Hannaford brand or Shaw's brand or like the Walmart brand of milk, like some of that milk, it's, you know, that milk is mostly bottled in New York State somewhere because that's where most of those places bottle their milk. So a percentage of that milk comes from Vermont. It goes on a truck, it goes out to New York, gets put in a bottle, comes back to those stores.
And that would be conventional milk.
That's conventional.
So how about organic milk?
So if you're buying Organic Valley milk in Vermont, they do have a New England pastures. I can't remember what the name of it's called, but that milk is mostly milk from Vermont with a few New Hampshire farms in there, and I think some from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And that is that's a regional brand, and that's an HTST milk, so it only has a 2-week or so shelf life on it. But you have to know, as a consumer, you have to look at it and be like, okay, Organic Valley, that's a brand I recognize, but is it from a New England plant or is it from a Wisconsin plant, or a Michigan plant or wherever? Because they sell both in New England, and it's hard to differentiate. The packaging is similar. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's deceptive. I think that it does state on there like this is the brand of New England milk. But when there's not enough of that, or they haven't bottled enough of that, they will supplement with milk from elsewhere.
So next year, we won't have to wonder anymore if we're getting Horizon milk, because we'll know it's not coming from Vermont.
Yes.
And it's not coming from New Hampshire, and it's not coming from Maine.
Or New York.
Some will be from New York.
Some will be from New York, but mostly Eastern New York is not going to be from Eastern New York either.
That's right. That's right. So that seems to be going in the wrong direction to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I don't know, one of the reasons I got into organic agriculture back, you know, when I did, was that it was a closer connection to the consumer. You know, it was like, I can sell my milk and I know the people who are buying it know where it came from. You know, I think from a business perspective, from the perspective of Horizon, it's like, it's becoming a mature business. They're just like, oh, well, we buy it as cheap as we can, we sell it for as much as we can, and that's just the way it goes. Like, if you can't compete, then you go out of business. And that's, to me, that was really, it does not feel like that's what organic agriculture should be. It just feels like that's just, you know, it's industrial agriculture, which is a different thing. I mean, which isn't to say that I don't feel entirely comfortable putting limits on what other people can or should do in terms of size. I think that in terms of practices, there's a limit to what one farm can do. And I think there needs to be a limit on that. But in terms of size, if you have 1,000 cows and you can figure out how to get them all out on grass and eating pasture and walking back to the barn, you know, okay, like show me that that's what you're doing. I'll come take a look at it. And if it works, if they're getting, depends on who your certifier is, what percentage they're expected to get from grass. I'd like to see 75 or 80% of their intake from grass or more, but that's not the standard. I mean, the standard is now 30% of dry matter intake from grass. But, if you can achieve that, then, okay, good. But I don't see that there's a limit to how far a cow can walk to get that grass. But if a farmer, if you want to call them that anymore, wants to have 3 or 4 separate operations that each milk the maximum number of cows, and they can all walk to that grass, then I don't know. I mean, as long as the practices match the product, I think that, show me that you're doing that right, instead of being like, this is the rule, I'm going to cut it as close to that corner as possible. Because there's a soil fertility and animal health component of that, which is the reason that those standards exist. And
so a lot of people believe that organic dairy as an industry in America is not following the rule, and that they're they're going around it and finding certifiers who will approve it. Most famous case is Aurora in dairy, because they had the front page of the Washington Post saying they're not telling the truth.
Right. Well, and the thing that's sad about that to me is that it alienates consumers like across the board. But I see, because people are like, well, I don't know who to believe, so I'm just gonna, just give up on the whole buying organic stuff. But I also, for whatever reason, like there's a substantial number of small farmers who, for lack of a better turn of phrase, got into organic dairy, as the last flailings of desperate people. They were bankrupt, and like they looked at organic and they're like, well, it's got a better pay price, so maybe I can stay in business for a while if we get certified, without trusting, without knowing, understanding, or really believing in what it means, what the soul of organic, which is that it really truly does need to be sustainable. It needs to be done, in a not just ecologically friendly, but ecologically like beneficent way, where like my role here is not to just like not destroy the environment around me, but to make it better, to watch my ecosystem improve over time, to see more wildlife, to watch more, ducks land in my pond, to see more deer in my fields. Like those are good things. Unfortunately, the economic realities of dairy farming are just such that the pressure put on by the processors, by the purchasers of milk, is just to drive the price lower and lower, which means you either need to milk more cows to make the same amount of money, or you got to get more milk out of the same number of cows to make the same money that you did 5 years ago. And that's the pressure to do that is, the pressure from everything, from taxes to, vet bills to everything else goes up. And so if you're not growing, you're just falling further and further behind.
So have you got any thoughts about why it is that milk sells at a price that dairy farmers can't afford to make a living? I mean, it seems insane. Like,
Yeah.
Why is it that, and all these dairy farmers who are going to get put out of business next year, 8 years ago were making a pretty good living.
Yeah.
And they were good farmers, and they're good farmers, and they're doing a good job, and all of a sudden the price of milk went down. So why is that?
So individual farmers, especially dairy farmers, just like, we don't get to set the price. You're just not big enough. And you have to sell milk every other day. It has to be picked up by federal law and by standards of quality. Like, milk produced yesterday needs to leave the farm today, every day, all year round. And so it makes it really hard to negotiate, to be like, you can't have my milk until you pay me more money. You'd have to get all those farmers together and do that all at the same time to be like, no, you can't buy any milk today. Like, we all want more money. So someone would have to organize all those farmers and be like, here's our list of demands, here's what we want. And you have to, when you're negotiating with corporations, you got to do that constantly. Like they're like, well, we'll sign a 1-year contract, or maybe a 2-year contract, and then we'll revisit, which means you got to show back up to that renegotiation and be like, all right, we're here to renegotiate, and you're not getting any milk until we negotiate this. And then, then the corporation will sit up and listen, because, without that product, the raw material, they can't put the product on the shelf and they don't make any money. And that's where your leverage is. And farmers, dairy farmers especially, a lot of the ones that I know are sort of fiercely independent people, and they really think that they're going to do it on their own. That's their belief. It's almost never been the case. Like the successful milk co-ops They start out their farmer run, and there's farmers who are there, and they go to the meetings and they get involved. Excuse me, and they they do the stuff that is required to get that off the ground. So I don't know. I mean, the truth is that because milk is not a product that is routinely sold direct to consumers as a raw product, and the cost to process it into a finished product is relatively high and requires an investment in machinery and expertise, and then time to operate that machinery in order to put it in a bottle and get it to people, and it's still perishable, means that farmers have subcontracted that distribution to other people. And at first they did it, there was some farmer in the organization that was like, I will facilitate that. And then all co-ops that I've known about over time, that person, whoever that person was, that was like, I will lead the co-op, I will find a market for the milk, eventually stops milking cows and just does that. Or they end up hiring somebody to do that and be like, we will hire this guy, we know him, he's like, neighbor from down the road, we're going to pay him a decent amount of money, and he's going to market our milk for us. He's going to negotiate with and this is the story of Cabot and Agrimark and Dairy Farmers of America and Land O'Lakes and every other co-op out there, is that really quickly at the beginning, within a few years or maybe at most a few decades, they're not run by farmers anymore. Farmers still technically vote and can be on the board, but there's a manager, there's a executive officer that is running the co-op, who's like, I will negotiate prices for you, I will find a market for you, and I'll make sure you get paid. But you look at those co-ops now, and they barely exist for the benefit of the farmers. They mostly exist for the benefit of the executives that run them. Yeah. They'll tell you that they exist for the benefit of the farmers, but they don't really. And that's true even with Organic Valley, which is a relatively small co-op and is fairly new. But now they're moving in the direction that every other co-op's moved in, which is that the people who run it are no longer themselves farmers.
Right.
They're paid to do it. And they paid pretty well, 6-figure salaries, because that's what you get paid if you're an executive of a company.
So I understand that in this way, capitalism is a bad deal for farmers because they constantly lose in the equation unless they become very industrial. But it also seems like it's a bad deal for the eaters. The idea is that, but stuff keeps getting cheaper so that we can afford better food and it costs less. But I don't think we're getting better food a lot. I think we're getting worse food a lot.
Well, and yes, you're getting worse food. That's just the way what it comes down to, is that and that's what I said earlier, is that quality matters, and the way you get quality is by people having that feeling of, I don't know how to put it, they're invested in producing the quality product. The industrial model, which farmers, you're forced to buy into it, is that you've got to produce more for less money. That's the standard that you're held to. That's success. On a production scale, is it did you produce more this year, a more quantity, and were you able to get by on less dollars per unit, whatever it is that you're selling? That's considered success. Is you're more efficient because it costs you less money to produce it and you produce more of them. And the problem with dairy farming, especially in Vermont, where land values are really high, is that and access to land is disrupted by topography a lot. Hills all over the place, and so I can't just add another pasture to the south of my pasture and make the cows walk out there and eat that grass. I'd have to drive there with a tractor and cut the grass and haul it back. And the further I go, the harder it is to manage it properly. just means that, at some point there's a diminishing return. You go to a big dairy farm in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Michigan, and there's a limit to even those huge industrial scale, CAFO, farms they only get to a certain size before they have to replicate that model down the road, because you can only travel so far to harvest the feed to bring it back and also to distribute the manure back out again, which is when you start running into those problems where it's like, oh, we're getting all this cow shit into the lake, or whatever, because it's just too much. So there's a limit, regardless of which system you ascribe to. And, for organic farming, there's a limit to how big you can get, just period, because you're going to run out of real estate.
To be a real organic farm.
To be a real organic farm. But even to be a fake organic farm, you're still going to run out of capacity. It's just like, and that's the thing that their system, that industrial system, is going to bump up against at some point, is they're just going to be like, it's not working anymore. We need to cut another corner somewhere. We need to make it even less organic because we're not making enough money. The margin is too small. So, we gotta. And I don't have an answer to that. I mean, our model isn't scalable, I don't think. Not really.
Is it replicable?
Yeah, probably.
So other small farms, dairy farms, could set up their own bottling and sell to their neighbors, to their region?
Yeah. The difficulty is you go to the bank and you're like, this is what I want to do. And then, everybody wants to see what's your plan for growth. Because, honestly, you have to borrow money because it's expensive. I mean, even if you have a bunch of value tied up in real estate or whatever, it's like you go to the bank, you're like, I want to borrow, $250,000 to build a milk processing plant. You better have a business plan in hand that's going to show where the growth is going to come from. And that's the challenge. It's like I don't know how to answer that question, because the growth, I don't know. I mean, like I've said, we've been growing. Like, that's what we do, but we've increased in size by a factor of 4 in 23 years, which is incredibly slow growth compared to the industrial norm. It's like, oh, you're only growing at 2% a year. It's like, that's not fast enough. You got to grow faster. And like, at some point, I'm gonna have to stop growing. There's just no room to grow anymore.
Yeah.
And hopefully at that point we find, we've filled the market and we have loyal customers and we're able to, maintain a level of profitability that we can keep going, like for the foreseeable future. But in the system that we're in now, the current economic system, I don't know if that's actually going to be the thing that happens.
Yeah. I know that you work incredibly hard. I think dairy farmers work harder than anybody. I know that. But it's interesting that the farms that are going out of business, they work incredibly hard too. And so it's not that they didn't work hard enough. And I see people sort of like Bambi versus Godzilla. It was a very short movie.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
I see people who feel that, they're kind of in a situation where they can't possibly win. But at the same time, I see millions of eaters who actually would like to buy their milk.
Right. Yeah.
So to me, that's a tragic situation.
It is. And I think that the challenge there is always going to be to convince. Most dairy farmers don't want to process milk, because processing milk is a completely different job. It's like I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to describe it. It's like you're working in a factory. You know, it's like even on a small scale, it's still, even if you only keep it to pretty limited, you know, spectrum of dairy products, you still like there's a lot of stuff you have to do which has nothing to do with milking cows or growing crops or anything else. It's, you know, like putting stickers on bottles and, you know, filling pints with ice cream, which is it's a good and rewarding job. But it's not what most dairy farmers signed up to do. I mean, so you kind of need to have somebody else do that. And then, you know, then you have to figure out who that person is. And
you got to manage a bigger crew, which is also not what most dairy farmers signed up to do.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, like you asked a question before about whether it's replicable, and the answer to that is it definitely is. But I think it would make more sense if it was replicable where as a partnership. So you have a dairy farmer and you have someone who wants to process that dairy farmer's milk. And those people get together, or that small group of people get together and be like, I can raise the cows and raise the crops and feed the cows and produce the milk and manage the manure and do all the crop work and all the cow work and all the vet work and all that stuff. And the other person is like, I can take what you're producing and turn it into a product that I can sell to customers.
That's exactly what they did at Side Hill down in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And they started making yogurt, and then it worked and it worked and it worked. They were a dairy farm.
Yeah.
And then they realized they were working 100 hours a week, and they're like, you know, this wasn't quite what I had in mind. I wanted to have a life that wasn't entirely work.
Right.
And so they broke it into two parts and sold the milking, the dairy cows, to a young couple, and they are continuing to make the yogurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's, you know, our structure now is I spend almost all of my time, you know, doing cow work, which is the thing that I like most, and some of my time doing crop work, which is a thing I like slightly less. Excuse me. But I also spend a fair amount of time doing, you know, maintaining the creamery equipment and machinery because I know it and I'm okay at it. And my wife spends almost all of her time processing milk and marketing it. Yeah. Like they're two separate businesses.
Yeah.
They're two separate, you know, they're completely different types of businesses as well. And that system is working reasonably well for us. It's not super fun sometimes to negotiate with your wife about business stuff. Yeah. You know, it makes date night not very interesting. It's like,
right.
But you know, she does a good job. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Can I jump back for a minute? Because we were interrupted. You said in the early days when you started, you sold to Organic Cow. Mm-hmm. And then Organic Cow was bought by Horizon. They were both very young at that point. And did Organic Cow just become called Horizon at that point? Or did they?
Yeah, so Organic Cow, the brand stuck around for a while. I mean, a little bit of history there. The Organic Cow brand went into a partnership with H.P. Hood, who bottled Organic Cow brand milk in Massachusetts. Then H.P. Hood sold the brand to Dean Foods. Dean Foods also at the time owned Horizon. I think they actually still do.
Yeah. No, they get sold, but yeah.
So over time, Dean was like, okay, now we're going to take these two brands and merge them together. Because it doesn't make any sense for us as a big company to have two brands of organic milk. One is very regional in the Northeast. One is sort of not quite national, but pretty big. We're just going to expand the Horizon brand nationwide and eliminate the Organic Cow brand. And that took about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So we started bottling milk in the spring of 2001, which was about the time that H.P. Hood. So Hood sold their share of their remaining shares of Organic Cow to Dean that winter, the winter of 2000, 2001. And that's when we jumped. Immediately,
there was downward price pressure?
Immediately.
On the pay price to farmers?
So when Peter Flint was running the Organic Cow, the pay price went from $18 a hundredweight to $21 a hundredweight. and then he added a whole quality premium on top of that. So, if your smack cell count was low and your butter, fat, and protein were high and your bacteria counts were low, we were making like $25 a hundredweight. And then when it went to Dean, they're like, we need to establish a standard across the whole country. We're going to lower the pay price back to $19 a hundredweight and eliminate the upper tiers of all the quality premiums.
No quality bonus.
So there was a quality bonus, but it was very small. So, and it was like the standard for quality was actually pushed higher, but there was only one tier. So it was like, instead of having a quality that was under 100,000 somatic cell count, under 2, under 3, they just went to, if you're under 225,000, we'll give you an extra, I think it was 75 cents a hundredweight. But
so I'm assuming that downward price pressure continued over the years with Horizon.
I wasn't selling milk to them anymore, but from what I heard, there was a time when Organic Valley came in, which happened that same summer that we started processing milk, there was competition for farms. So Organic Valley came in and said, well, you'd have to buy in your equity, buy shares in their co-op, but they paid more money. So then a lot of farms went that direction. So Horizon then was like, oh, well, we'll pay more money. So there was an escalation there because there was the competitors. So they were like, oh, well, it kept creeping up. Got to $24, $25 a hundredweight, $27, $28 a hundredweight, because they were trying to build market share. They're trying to, build a milk supply. And that continued for a while, for like 7 or 8 years. The price kept going up. It got up into the upper 30s dollars per hundredweight for high quality milk. And then just in the last, 5 to 8 years, it's crashed.
So in order for it to crash, there must have been a competing milk source for those companies.
Yes. Well,
where was that?
That was out west. That was, Texas and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico, on big farms that, although they were able to get organic certification, didn't have any real. They weren't really organic farms. They're like, they would transition in first calf heifers. They would have a calf. They're like, oh, now we're going to start feeding her organic grain. She's organic. We can't put them out to pasture because there's no pasture to be had. It's too dry. There's no pasture. So the rule doesn't apply to us because we don't have a grazing season because we're in the desert. So we don't have a grazing season. So, whatever. We just feed cows just like we would if they were conventional. And from an animal health perspective, there's nothing about that was good. I mean, their cull rates were astronomically high. The use of sex-sorted semen to produce enormously large numbers of heifer calves meant that they could just milk cows until, they never have to bother to get them pregnant again. So they don't care what the state of their reproductive tract is. They're just like, we got a calf out of her. She's making milk. Like, we'll just milk her for, a year and a half, and then she goes on the beef truck. And that was that became the industry norm.
Yeah.
So.
Well, these are really interesting and perilous times, I think, for the whole organic movement. Because if we say that is organic, if that's what organic means,
right,
it's not what I meant.
No, and it's not what I meant, and it's not what most consumers, I don't think, understand it to be. I think it's very, very much not that. It's very, it's not organic at all. I mean, there's nothing about it that appears organic to me. Like, not even like, there's no trace of what I would think is organic in there, because it's an exploitive model. It's a model that is like, we will take full advantage of everything we possibly can and, give back as little as is possible to achieve that, which is, it's the opposite of my perspective on organic has always been that the purpose of it, as I've said before, is like to build something, to build soil predominantly. That's like to build a healthy, soil ecosystem is like, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it's like to build, high quality food for human beings goes along with that. It's inseparable.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, and I don't know how that works, out west. It's like, I've never been to any of those farms. I don't know that much about them. They buy all their feed. They're not cultivating any crops. They're just like, they're producing enormous quantities of manure that I don't know what happens to. So they're not building soil. There's no closed loop there. There's no, like, we grow the feed, we feed the cows, we spread the manure back to grow the next crop of feed to feed the cows. That's not happening. There is no cycle that exists there. And, I think that if you ask them, they would be like, oh yeah, no, totally, we definitely do that. But who the hell knows?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what an organic certifier is supposed to do. They're supposed to go there and be like, show me how this is working. But, if you can pick and choose your certifier and decide, like, this is what we do, and you need to sign off on that, you get nothing.
Yeah.
I think it's getting dark, isn't it?
Well, we should go before it gets pitch dark.
Yeah.
These cameras are amazing, but do you have any last words, Earl?
Well, sure. I mean, the thing about being a dairy farmer, or being a farmer in general, and dairy farmer in particular, is that, like, you have to just be optimistic. There's just no way around it. It's like, there's always like, oh, well, the next season is going to be great. Like, things are going to work out. And I'm still that way. Like, I still think about all the potential that's not being realized here. I mean, because I mostly think about my farm. I don't really have much control over other things. And, what can I do? What can I change? What can I tweak? What can I make work better next year? How can I do a better job, of all the things that I do? And that, it makes me optimistic, keeps me optimistic. So, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's hope yet. I mean, I think that, consumers have huge capacity to learn and understand, what's happening. And they appear to have a great appetite for it. Not all of them, but a large portion of them. And the ones that don't, there's hope for them yet. They might come around and start caring about where their food comes from.
It seems like I'm certainly getting a greater understanding of all the ways in which just about everything is connected.
Yeah.
And, the climate is in our face now.
Yeah.
And to see the connection to agriculture is inescapable
Yeah.
at this point. And so people are going, oh, I never realized that this was so complicated and so interesting.
Right. Well, and that's the thing I think helps keep me optimistic, is that, like, it is really interesting. It's fascinating. The subtleties of an ecosystem and on large scale and a small scale is just like, the interconnectedness is just mind-boggling in a good way, to the sense that, like, I love having my mind boggled. It's just like, that's the coolest thing ever, finding those things and just being like, that's really, really awesome.
All right.
So,
Earl Ransom, thank you very much for spending this hour with me.
well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you will subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a rating and review. A video version of this interview, as well as the full transcript with links related to our conversation, can be found at realorganicproject.org/episode 63. Please join us next time when our guest is Amanda Starbuck, Senior Food Researcher and Policy Analyst at Food and Water Watch. To support this podcast and our certified farmers, please become a recurring donor at realorganicproject.org. See you next time.